Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt. The waitress pleaded, her voice cracking. But little did she know, the Undercover CEO witnessed it all, and what happened next would change everything. What if a single act of cruelty could spark the most profound transformation in a person's life? Julia leaned against the cool brick wall behind Tony's diner. Her uniform still damp from the coffee a customer had deliberately spilled on her moments before. At 34, she was no stranger to invisible wounds, the kind that came from juggling 3 jobs just to keep her 8-year-old son fed and sheltered. Her hands trembled as she wiped away tears, not just from the sting of the hot coffee on her arm, but from the customer's cutting words. Maybe if you weren't so clumsy, you wouldn't be stuck serving people like me. She had no idea that inside the diner, a man dressed in worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt had seen the entire incident. David Chun, a man whose net worth rivaled that of some small nations, had been quietly observing from a corner booth. The scene he just witnessed caused a knot to form in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a righteous anger, a fierce protectiveness. Julia had been working at Tony's diner for 8 long months, ever since the auto parts factory where she'd spent the previous 6 years shuttered its doors. The diner job barely covered the rent on the cramped apartment she shared with her son, Michael. But it was honest work, and she'd learned long ago to find dignity in any labor that put food on their table. Most customers were decent enough, tired truckers who left generous tips, elderly couples who smiled warmly when she refilled their coffee. But lately, a new kind of clientele had emerged, people who seemed to revel in reminding her of her place, of her perceived insignificance. David had been a regular at the diner for 3 weeks, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and a slice of whatever pie was fresh that day. He was unassuming in his appearance, driving an older pickup truck and speaking in a soft, almost hesitant voice. Julia had pegged him as another working man, perhaps a contractor or a mechanic, someone who understood the true value of a hard-earned dollar. She'd noticed his calloused hands, the way he always said please and thank you, and how he quietly left a $20 bill for a $12 meal. What Julia didn't know was that David had been quietly visiting diners and restaurants across the country for months. Not as the CEO of Chin Industries, but as a man, a regular Joe, trying to understand the businesses he was considering acquiring. His company specialized in revitalizing struggling establishments, transforming them into thriving hubs of the community. But he'd quickly learned that spreadsheets and profit margins couldn't tell him what he really needed to know about a place. He needed to feel its pulse, to witness how people treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. The customer who had humiliated Julia was a regular, a man named Frank, who seemed to take perverse pleasure in making the staff uncomfortable. David had observed this pattern for weeks. The deliberately spilled drinks, the snide remarks about Julia's appearance, the way Frank would leave exact change, never a tip, after forcing her to clean up messes he'd created on purpose. Each incident had caused David's jaw to clench a little tighter, his frustration growing with each petty act. But tonight, Frank had crossed a line. As Julia stepped back inside the diner, trying to regain her composure, Frank was already waving impatiently for more coffee. "Hurry up," he barked. "And try not to spill it this time." The few other customers in the diner looked away, shifting uncomfortably, but no one intervened. That's when David, his decision made, quietly rose from his corner booth. He walked slowly toward Frank's table, his footsteps measured and calm. Julia was already approaching with a fresh pot of coffee, her shoulders tight with anxiety. Frank looked up at David with annoyance. "What do you want? I'm trying to get some service here." "I've been watching you," David said, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the entire diner. "For weeks. I've watched you treat this woman with complete disrespect." His tone wasn't overtly angry. It was something deeper, a quiet disappointment that cut through the noise more effectively than any shout. Frank's face reddened. "Mind your own business, pal. If she can't handle the job, maybe she should find another one." He turned his gaze to Julia, who stood frozen, the coffee pot trembling in her hands. "Well, are you going to pour or not?" Julia's hands shook as she began to tilt the pot. She'd endured this treatment because she desperately needed this job. Her son's school had sent home another notice about overdue lunch money just yesterday. The electric bill was past due. She simply couldn't afford to lose even a single day's pay. But as she started to pour, David gently placed his hand over the cup, stopping her. "No," he said simply. "Julia, you don't need to serve someone who treats you like you're less than human." He turned his gaze to Frank, his eyes unwavering. "And you need to understand something. Every person in this diner has a story, has people who love them, has dreams and struggles just like you do. The difference is, most of us don't use our own pain as an excuse to inflict it on others." Frank stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. "Who the hell do you think you are, talking to me like that? You're just some blue-collar nobody." David's expression remained calm, but a flicker of steel flashed in his eyes. "Maybe, but I know the difference between a man and a bully." He reached into his wallet and placed a crisp $100 bill on Frank's table. "Your meals are covered for the next month. But here's the deal. You're going to start treating every person who works here with respect, or you're going to find somewhere else to eat." The diner remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Julia felt tears welling up again, but this time, they weren't born of humiliation. This time, they were tears of gratitude, of disbelief. She'd never had anyone stand up for her like this, defend her dignity when she felt powerless to defend it herself. Frank, visibly shaken and embarrassed, threw some crumpled bills on the table and stormed out of the diner, muttering under his breath. But David wasn't finished yet. As the diner slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, Julia realized her hands were still shaking. She carefully set the coffee pot down on the counter and looked at David, a mixture of gratitude and confusion swirling within her. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I could have handled it." David's expression softened. "I know you could have. You've been handling it for weeks. But just because you can endure something doesn't mean you should have to." He gestured toward the booth where he'd been sitting. "Could we talk for a few minutes?" Julia glanced toward the kitchen, where Tony was pretending not to watch while expertly flipping burgers. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The dinner rush was over, and the few remaining customers seemed content to linger over their coffee. She followed David to his booth, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand, "and I owe you an apology." "An apology? For what?" "For sitting here for 3 weeks, watching that man disrespect you, and not saying anything until tonight. I've been coming here to understand this place better. I'm in the restaurant business, and I was considering making an offer to buy Tony's diner." Julia's heart sank. Another corporate buyer, another business that would probably close within months, leaving her jobless and scrambling once again. "Oh," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. David saw the fear flicker across her face and quickly continued. "But what I've learned here isn't in any business plan. I've watched you work 3 different shifts, cover for other employees when they're sick, and treat every customer with kindness, even when they don't deserve it. You remember how people like their coffee, you check on the elderly customers to make sure they're okay. And you do all of this while dealing with your own struggles. How do you know about my struggles?" Julia asked defensively, her guard immediately going up. "Because I recognize them," David said gently. "I grew up in a house where my mother worked 3 jobs just like you do. I've seen that look in someone's eyes when they're counting every dollar, when they're exhausted but can't afford to rest." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Julia, what if I told you that you've already proven everything you need to prove? That watching you work has taught me more about leadership and dignity than any business school ever could." Julia stared at David, trying to process what he was telling her. "I don't understand. What do you mean you're in the restaurant business?" David reached into his wallet again, but this time he pulled out a simple business card. Julia took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She read it twice before the words truly sank in. "David Chun, CEO, Chun Industries." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're..." I'm someone who believes that the best businesses are built on treating people right, David said simply. And you've shown me exactly what that looks like. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense and sincere. Julia, I want to buy this diner, but I want to do it the right way. I want to turn it into something that honors the community it serves. And I want you to help me do it. I don't know anything about running a business, Julia protested, shaking her head. But David shook his head in return. You know everything about what matters. You know how to make people feel welcome, how to work hard, how to care about others, even when you're struggling yourself. His voice grew more earnest. I'm offering you a partnership, Julia. Not just a job, a real stake in making this place everything it could be. Julia felt her world tilting on its axis, the solid ground beneath her feet suddenly shifting. I have a son, and I've never. She stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of the offer. Your son is exactly why this could work, David said gently, his voice filled with conviction. Every decision we make will be about creating the kind of place where families like yours can thrive. Better wages, health care, profit sharing, college funds for employees' children. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. I've been looking for someone who understands what it means to build something real, something that matters. Watching you work these past weeks, seeing how you treat people, how you never give up, that's exactly what I've been searching for. Tears started streaming down Julia's cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of hope, of possibility, of a future she had dared not dream of. Why me? She choked out. You could have anyone. Because anyone can manage numbers on a spreadsheet, David replied, a warm smile spreading across his face. But not everyone has a heart that sees people the way you do. Not everyone understands that the most important part of any business is how it makes people feel about themselves. He reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers, offering a silent reassurance. Julia, what would you say if I told you that in 6 months, you could be the general manager of the finest community restaurant in 3 states? 6 months later, Julia stood in the completely renovated dining room of what was now called Julia's Table, watching her 8-year-old son, Michael, carefully arrange fresh flowers on each table. The transformation had been beyond anything she could have imagined. The old, cracked vinyl booths had been replaced with comfortable, upholstered seating. The harsh fluorescent lights had given way to warm, inviting fixtures, and the walls now displayed vibrant artwork from local artists, including a beautiful painting Michael had created of the diner's new garden. But the real changes went far deeper than mere aesthetics. Every employee now earned a living wage and enjoyed comprehensive healthcare benefits. The staff included 2 other single mothers who'd been struggling to make ends meet, a retired schoolteacher who wanted part-time work to stay active and engaged, and 3 teenagers saving for college with the help of the restaurant's education fund. Julia had discovered she possessed a natural gift for organizing, training, and inspiring others. Skills that David had recognized in her long before she'd even seen them in herself. Tony had stayed on as head cook and part owner, his traditional diner recipes now perfectly complemented by seasonal specials that Julia had developed by carefully listening to customers' stories about their grandmother's cooking. The restaurant had become exactly what David had envisioned. A true community center where people came not just for the food, but for connection, for a sense of belonging. The customer message board by the entrance was constantly filled with thank you notes, job postings, and offers of help from neighbors. Julia had even started a wall of kindness, a program where customers could buy meals for those in need, no questions asked. The wall never stayed empty for long, a testament to the generosity of the community they served. David still came by regularly, though now he preferred to sit at the counter and let Julia pour him coffee while they discussed expansion plans. 3 other communities had already inquired about opening their own Julia's Table locations, each one to be run by someone with Julia's heart for service and understanding of what it meant to struggle. As Julia watched Michael help seat an elderly couple at their favorite table by the window, she remembered that dark and lonely night 6 months ago, when she'd stood outside in the cold, feeling invisible and utterly defeated. She thought about how one person's willingness to see her inherent dignity, to recognize her worth, had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who walked through these doors. Frank had never returned to the restaurant, but Julia often wondered if he'd learned something that night, too. She hoped he had. She'd discovered that carrying resentment was simply too heavy a burden when there was so much joy to be found in building something beautiful, something meaningful. David appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice gentle and knowing. "Just thinking about how everything can change in a moment," Julia said, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. "How one person choosing kindness can create ripples that reach further than they'll ever know." "That's what you do every day, Julia," David replied, his eyes filled with admiration. "You create those ripples."